Let's start with a brief prayer this evening. So the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Almighty and eternal God, so draw our hearts to you, so guide our minds, so fill our imaginations, so control our wills, that we may be wholly yours, utterly dedicated to you, and to use us, we pray, as you would use us, and always to your glory and the welfare of your people, through our Lord Jesus Christ and Savior. Amen. Just wanted to do a quick overview of what we did last week. And in talking about, really, we talked about formation, lifelong formation, what it is, how we believe in the Episcopal Church. This is a quote from John Westerhoff that comes out of a text called Call to Teach and Learn, which we talked about last week, in which it says that formation is the participation in and practice of the Christian life of faith. It is the same process that nurtures and converts, the means by which a community's worldview and value system are transmitted. And last week we mentioned Maria Harris, and in her book, Fashion Me a People, that there are 5 areas that we do this in formation. It is through the koinonia, or the curriculum of the community. It is through the liturgia, or the liturgy, curriculum of prayer. It is through the didache, what we are teaching, all of those things that have come before us, scripture, prayer, our tradition. The kerygma, how are we proclaiming the good news of Jesus? And then the diaconia, how are we going forth in service to the world to bring the good news and to share the others? We also reviewed the formation of the Sunday school, where that came from, and it's 4 purposes through 4 generations of, and we used my family as an example. My grandmother, my mother, who was a member of the silent generation, or some might call the GI generation, myself as a baby boomer, and my daughter, who's a millennial. And from that, we talked about what worked and what didn't work. So our learnings that we can carry forward, I think, from the past, and this includes all the generations, is what worked was when there was experiential learning going on, when it was not just the sage on the stage or the teacher leading. What worked was sharing stories, having everyone share stories with each other. Faith in action. A number of participants talked about specific examples that they remember doing, of putting their faith in action. Being conscious of what was going on in the world around them. So, for example, during World War II, for my mother's generation, there was very much a sense of being industrious because everyone in the country needed to contribute to the war effort. So a lot of that translated over into the church and how they learned and studied in the church, that they needed to be productive. So there was lots of ways of doing things. And the missionary emphasis of the church was very much world conscious also, from being a propagation of the gospel instead of just perhaps helping spread the good news and helping others. Faith at home is something that has worked, but it hasn't always been tapped into as a possibility. I think it's just starting to have a resurgence now. And then grassroots models. We have learned that those are the ones that last the longest. Things that come up from the local level, from individuals that are really creative. And we'll talk about a couple of those that still exist that have been around a while. What didn't work necessarily, perhaps a little bit during that time, but over the long haul, didn't make a difference in people's faith, was rote learning, memorizing things, unless they were things that of a person's choice that they could count on for the future. What doesn't work is having a teacher, a sage on the stage who is doing all of the teaching and not being a collaborator in that. Children being absent from worship has taken away from their really understanding who we are as Episcopalians and as a worshiping community. And certainly mission being colonization of the other instead of being in partnership with others, isolation, parishes perhaps not looking beyond their own doors, and competition and product. Sometimes there were times in the past where everyone was rewarded for participating or for doing something and for producing a product. And that doesn't have a whole lot of lasting effects to that. So here are some of the things that have come out of the grassroots that still are useful to us. Godly Play was a grassroots model that came out of Jerome Berriman's work with children in a hospital setting in Houston, Texas. Now it's an international phenomena, and not just for children. Also, many people are using it with youth, with adults, and certainly with elders and those experience dementia. Journey to Adulthood tapped into something that was really of an essence of that wondering sense of awe and having collaboration with the seeker. And in case you don't know, Journey to Adulthood is being re-released this June or July with totally new materials, still following the same format of Right 13, J2A, and now it's not called Young Adults in Community. I think it's called Forward or something like that. I forget that. But new lesson plans that can be done in 45 minutes that are standalone and still follow the same kind of pattern, but certainly more understanding of gender in how we address God, and certainly gender fluidity with youth and all people of God, and lots more age appropriate and useful things to be done at all size churches, not just large churches. And then Education for Ministry, which has been around for a really long period of time too, I think more than 40 years, which is also now international. And that really understands and respects the learner, and that adults can learn and make their own choices in their learning. General Convention also, from the grassroots, developed a number of resources called To Teach and Learn, we talked about last week. But I didn't mention the Children's Charter of the Church, which came out in 1997 and was reaffirmed at General Convention in 2000. And the Charter for Lifelong Christian Formation and Education, which is fairly recent. The handout in your toolbox will have links to those documents. All of these are commended to parishes and dioceses to use and implement in how do we lift up the importance of children in our midst, and how do we lift up the importance of adult formation. That formation is lifelong. It doesn't end with confirmation, for sure. So we're going to jump now into the 21st century, where we are right now. And this is the time that we're living in. So the graphic isn't too old. It's only a year and a half, maybe old. And we've talked now about the silent generation, baby boomers, Gen X, and millennials. And you can see, as the more global we become as a society, the less affiliated people in the US seem to be. I'm not sure if that's a true correlation, but that's what I sort of read from that. As we become more global, we look to more things, or we're more distracted, or perhaps one way of thinking is not always the same. We see the rise of nuns, those who are either unaffiliated or don't believe at all. We know there's been a drop in memberships and churches. Also, the population of those in our churches is older, and those with children or youth and young adults don't attend church in the same way post-silent and boomers did, because of all of those things we talked about last week, like blue laws. There's lots of other things you can do on a Sunday now. There's budget reductions. There was a time in the Episcopal Church when every diocese had a Christian education person or a children's minister and a youth minister on staff, and that no longer exists. And the same for parishes who were of program or resource size who had staff people that were lay people most of the time who oversaw those ministries, and that is no longer the case. We know we live in a global society where anything is at the tip of our fingers on a digital device 24/7, 365 days of the year. That technology and that highly mobility of moving and not having to be in one place at one time is the reality today. And certainly COVID has taught us that and enforced that, as we're able to all participate in webinars and workshops and major conferences from the comfort of our home. There's certainly some disadvantages to that because we don't get to share with each other and network in the same way and see friends, but we're able to access a whole lot more than we ever did before. In the midst of that, of course, we've got terrorism, pandemics, and anxiety. And possibly those last three things have only increased in the past year as opposed to the past. Hopefully you can see, you know what, I'm going to go back a little bit first. Well, I skipped something here that I wanted to share with you, and that is about research that Renewal Works of Forward Movement has done regarding these generations on the screens. So they have done a number of online assessments. They're still doing it. You may be in a parish that has participated in those, but some of their resources or their results of their surveys have discovered that 18% of people want to explore a life with God in Christ, taking a first step. But most people who took the survey in parishes want to be more committed to a Christian faith, but have a lot of questions. 55% have lots of questions. They're looking for a deepening their life with Christ and have a faith with God in their daily life. They want to center their life more on God with Christ, but the data shows that they're not getting assistance with those things from their parishes. And most of the respondents have reported that their church does not provide resources that teach, model, or encourage spiritual practices, which is what there seems to be a great hunger for. So keeping that in mind, this is a chart, and hopefully you can see it, because this is who's in our pews today. We've got the builders. They're calling this the builders or the GI or silent generation. And the pieces that I'd like you to kind of, if you can sort of squirm in to look at, are ones that are focus on the pieces that were life-changing events for them. So, and this is, I have to say, the resource comes from McKindle, which is a marketing company in Australia. So some of the terms are, and the references are probably more from an Australian viewpoint. For example, they felt that for baby boomers, the moon landing was a social marker. Perhaps that is true. I'm a boomer and I would not consider that a social marker for me. I would consider probably the assassination of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King as a marker for myself as a memory. But and each of us might have our own. So these are just examples. But for certain, Generation Y, which are the millennials, September 11th is a sure marker for them. Generation Z, which are the children in our church now and our youth. So Generation Z is from 2007 probably to about 2010, something like that. And so the global financial crisis has affected them. I'm going to say the pandemic will replace that for Generation Z. And then Generation Alpha, which are the preschoolers and kindergarteners right now. My granddaughter is a Gen Alpha, and right now they put it as Trump and Brexit. I think the pandemic will definitely be there also. For many of them, school, that's all that's meant for them is the pandemic. And then the other interesting things is about leadership styles, which I think will be important for us to remember. And I spoke to my son, who's a math teacher at a high school, and I asked him about these different leadership styles and how he uses them or sees them in his classrooms. So I started with mine and you can see that sort of more toward the bottom underneath the little graphics. So underneath the audio cassette, which was a big thing, as I was a young adult, I think. But my learning took place as there was a leader. And so the teacher was the person who led all the things. And it was a very structured classroom. The teachers were the experts. Then for my daughter, we skipped a generation with her, but my daughter as a millennial, a leader was more of a guider or teacher, but her schooling was a lot more interactive, and peers were certainly a whole lot more important that she looked to for advice than parents or other adults. Today, and my son said that he, in his teaching, it's a blending between what Generation Y, millennials, and Generation Z are doing right now. He says that as a teacher, he is a hub. He supports his students. Sometimes he's directing and he is the structured part of the classroom, but most of his role, he feels as a teacher, is to be interactive and get the young people to work in teams. So lots of peer-to-peer engagement. And he's also doing the more of the empowering type, in which he stands outside of them and watches them interact with each other and helps them collaborate with each other. And so there's a lot more group interaction in that way for them. And I said, well, I don't understand the difference between an empowering leader and an inspiring leader. And he said, well, the inspiring leader, that part of it is you are learning along with your students. So I think of that model as very much like an EFM model, where there's a mentor who's not the teacher, but is is one of the students, is learning alongside them. And he said, yes, that is a model for sure that is being used in classrooms today, in that the teacher will help be a co-creator with them, but so much is virtual also. So everyone is more collaborative and working together, and with the teachers side by side learning with them. So and it's interesting to look at what the iconic toys are. Fidget spinners were a whole new thing to me, not having a child in that, but I hear lots of times when people are putting together quiet bags for in worship, and lots of suggestions have been to put fidget spinners in them for that. Interesting graphics. So there's lots of really interesting data on this particular website. They have lots of images, but their purpose is, how do we market to these kinds of folks? And I think for the church, that's a helpful lens to look at, because oftentimes in this day and age, we do need to market to our audiences because they're not naturally going to come to us. Now I'd like to share with you a model that some of you may have seen already. This comes from John Roberto of Lifelong Faith Associates. And I was part of the initial group that was privileged to work with him in coming up with what he would call a 2020 scenario. It was a matrix for faith formation in 2020. And we did that in 2008. It might even been a little bit later than that when we started rolling it out. But it was really to say, okay, what is religion, organized religion and Christianity, what's that going to look like in the future? Who are our audiences to do that? So if you look at this matrix in the middle, there's something what we called, and we decided to do this. It could have been anything that we decided, but this is what, in brainstorming of what we were seeing going on in churches and people's faith and what they were seeking, we came up with the statement, a hunger for God and the spiritual life. So we knew that people in society and in our churches either had a high hunger for God and the spiritual life, or they had a low hunger for the spiritual life. So those are the two polarities on the matrix. But then there are those on the top and the bottom who are receptive to organized religion, and then those who are resistant to organized religion. So we put those in the matrix, and then we tried to come up with describers. So what is a person? Who are the people that have a high hunger for God and the spiritual life and are receptive to organized religion? So that's scenario one. We call them that they have vibrant faith and an active engagement. So these are the folks, I'm guessing, that are always on your Zoom calls on Sundays, that before coronavirus, they were the ones who were in church every Sunday. They were on vestry. They were families with kids in church school. They were the adults who were showing up for book groups or prayer meetings, and they were there, very much involved in probably mission areas of the church. So it's really easy for us to be able to reach those folks. Most likely the renewal works, when they did their survey, it was to these folks. So these folks are still seeking spiritual, they still have a high hunger for spiritual life. And how are we in our churches today? How are we addressing their needs? Then I'm going to skip over to the other side, to the scenario 4. That is, the little words were cut off there, is unparticipating and uncommitted. So they're very receptive to organized religion, most likely because they were raised in a tradition or their parents were very religious. But so they'll come to church on Christmas and Easter. They'll show up every now and then, but they don't have a real hunger for God in the spiritual life. They don't think about it. Church is there when they want their children baptized, when their young people are old enough to be confirmed. Certainly when someone needs pastoral care, they turn to the church. And certainly if a family member dies or themselves, that's where they want to be buried from. So how do we reach those folks? How do we help boost their hunger for God in that? So that one might not be as much as a challenge as the two below, that are either spiritual but not religious, or unaffiliated and uninterested. So the spiritual but not religious are ones that I think are a lot of millennials right now, is because their faith, they can see faith in many things. They might have a blend of faith and spirituality. My sister-in-law considers herself a Christian, but she also has a number of Buddhist practices that she uses. She blends them all together and doesn't really know the difference between them. She's very interested in the Bible because she's never heard the stories before. So there's been lots of open opportunities for me for conversations with her. She lives in San Francisco, and she thinks it's the coolest thing that the cathedral there has a labyrinth on the floor, and that she goes and does yoga on it. So there's an opportunity there to get her perhaps to come a little bit more, or to see a little bit more value in having be part of more of an organized religion, even though she has a hunger for spiritual life. But she's a little more afraid of the institution piece of it. And then the spiritual and the unaffiliated and uninterested. How do we help gather them? A lot of that, I would say, would have to do with family. formation. Most of them are if they have children, are really interested in raising their children and wanting to do everything they can for their children. But both of those that are resistant to organized religion, I think, are very open to service and mission projects. They're very involved in Habitat for Humanity, in things like we called Stop Hunger now, has another title now. But all of those things that are really helpful, wanting to be mission oriented and help people. So how can we invite them in the community to be part of those kinds of things and then expose them to, why are we doing this? We're doing this is because this is what God calls us to do. And these also tap into their developing a hunger for God and a hunger for the spiritual life that we know we as a parish, as a church body, can give them. So one of the things that we've learned from the past that I think, are learning right now is that faith is caught, not taught. It is something that is experiential, that is hands-on, which is maybe why many are spiritual and not religious, or unaffiliated, and not part of an organized practice of faith. So John Westerhoff's quote here, which comes from will our children have faith? I always want to say, will our faith have children, which was from another conference that the Episcopal Church offered in 2003. But faith is caught, not taught. And we need to remember that moving forward. I'd like us to take some time and go into some breakout rooms, and Rowan will do that, split us up for that. And here's your question for that. Depending if you want to, you'll be a mix of groups. So there may be some of you that work with children, some with youth, some with adults, some are just here just to learn for themselves and grow in their own understanding. But to think about, what are your churches or your groups doing now to reach out to some of these groups during COVID time? What have you done in the past? Perhaps what have you done in the past? But what are you doing now with each of these scenario groups? Meaning scenario number one, the vibrant faith and active people, the people who are, were already engaged before the pandemic, the participating, but their spiritual life is non-important. So that's number 4 and number 1 are the ones sort of on the top. And then the ones on the bottom, spiritual but not religious, and the unaffiliated and the uninterested, because those are the growing populations for those. So we'll take about 6 minutes or so in small groups and talk about those discussions, those questions. And I need, oops. So I thought we would talk a little bit about who these Gen Z and Gen Alpha young people are that are going to be with us in the future, hopefully. We may not be seeing them so much today in our churches. One of the things Rowan and I were talking about was how most of them are on Zoom for school so much now that there's no way that they want to do that in church. So that they're, only when we're doing things in person will we be able to have them get connected for that. I know my parishes, we're going to do Stations of the Cross outside, and we're setting up all these stations so people can come and experience that. And we're hoping that we're creating it so that it can be for all generations for that. So let's talk about briefly today's teen and child. So today's teenagers and older children are Gen Z, born between 1997 and 2010, and Gen Alpha. And the word alpha comes from, because we've gone through the alphabet now. And so they've decided to go to the I guess it's Greek, whatever they name hurricanes, where they get that from. They're going to follow that pattern for that. And so probably after that, if alpha sort of beta will be next. So Generation Z are the children of Gen X and millennials, sort of crossing before all of these. They're known as Generation Connected or .com kids. And the interesting stuff I found out about them that I never realized, some I knew, like they've always known technology, is that 11% of them have had a different address in 2018 than they did the previous year. So this most likely is going to be a very mobile generation, and that means the next one probably will be also. This generation is on track to be the most educated generation there is, with a prediction that 1 in 2, at least, and this is the United States, 1 in 2 of this cohort will receive a college education, which surprises me because of the expense of college today. But maybe it will be more community college oriented and not big university, but that they will have college degrees. However, it will be predicted that they will work 18 jobs across 6 careers and live in 15 homes in their lifetime. I think back to my father's generation, so just one generation behind me, the silent generation. My dad worked one job. He lived in the same town his whole life, except when he retired, and he moved to a different community so he could move somewhere where he could afford to live. So totally different in all of that. Another surprise to me was that nearly 48% of 16 to 20-year-olds are either biracial, racial, or of an ethnic minority. So that's not really a minority anymore in those kinds of terms, compared to 39% of millennials. So that is increasing more. 35% of Gen Z know someone who prefers that others refer to them with gender neutral pronouns. And more, when I get on Zoom calls or other calls, today I was mentioning to Jennifer and Rowan before everyone came on that I was on a call from the Dougie Center earlier today, which is a grief support group out of Oregon. And they wanted us to actually label what our pronouns were. And that's not the first time that's happened to me in a Zoom room for that. Another thing that will not be surprised, and these statistics come before COVID, is that 7 in 10, 13 to 17-year-olds say anxiety and depression are major problems among their peers. They don't say it's among themselves, but they say it's among their peers. So that's an interesting statistic. We all know that depression is on the rise with young people today, and COVID has certainly attributed a lot to that. 61% of this generation feel a lot of pressure to get good grades. That's not a surprise. So this is a generation that's under a lot of pressure in a lot of ways. 50% see drug and alcohol as an issue. 4% feel the pressure to use drugs, and 6% feel a pressure to drink alcohol. For them, social media is their tool for communication. Not email, texting, or other forms right now with that. Then we'll look at the alpha generation. So this is a picture of Mackenzie, my granddaughter, she was born in 2015. So, and she's in kindergarten now. So she's the first generation that's really born totally in the 21st century. And many of her generation, I was surprised to learn, already have a digital footprint. I don't think she has an email or anything like that, but she's certainly very adept at knowing how to use an iPad, an iPhone, and certainly she goes to school on Zoom occasionally, so she knows how to work that all out. But Prince William's son, George, has an Instagram account. Granted, he's a celebrity, but I wonder how many parents have Instagrams for their kids, or other types of things that their children are certainly on the internet and being used on the internet in some ways. So a description that is starting to develop and what to call this generation is being the glass generation, meaning that they're always in front of glass fronted devices. Now, this picture of Mackenzie and my son-in-law, she's got a clipboard with a coloring page from they're in church, it's Easter Sunday, so she's dressed up sort of like previous generations, but they're both doing some kind of coloring of a worship bulletin. And it's interesting that my millennial son-in-law, who was raised Roman Catholic, but I would consider, I'm not sure I would consider him spiritual, but not religious, but he would be an Easter Christmas person, who wants to leave the Catholic Church and become, or he wanted to know how he could join the Episcopal Church or something like that. And he had no idea how any of that would be different. And it was mostly for political reasons he wanted to do that. Had nothing to do with what we're doing in church. So this generation will move all the time in front of digital things. We already know that there are cars that self-drive. Most likely when these kids come of age to be able to drive, if they'll even need to drive, or the car will drive for themselves. But everything that they do will have a glass in front of them in some kind of form. So either at their desk, at work, when they play, which is true in playing games, when they learn, when they connect with friends, when they shop, everything will be done looking through a glass, and even perhaps driving will have that, which really kind of blows my mind. One thing that is interesting and is already starting to happen is that they will move from a structured auditory method, kind of like what we're doing now, to a visual hands-on method, which is what my son was talking about doing. So all I could think of is what impact does that have on us in teaching in the church, whether it is with children, youth, or adults? How are we using a variety of technologies in our formation settings? This generation's going to prefer a virtual world, hopefully alongside a physical world and not to replace a physical world. But we need to create opportunities to be connected with these generations a whole lot more than what we have been with past generations, while still being connected with those past generations who are used to holding, well, some a prayer book and hymnal, but now at least a worship bulletin in their hands for that. Still, for both of these generations, there's that sense of awe and wonder. That has not gone away, nor has gone away the sense of sharing story. And if we remember, that was one of those best practices that has come through generations. So how can we tap into best practices of sharing our stories and doing it cross-generationally? And that doesn't mean having all generations together, but having my son-in-law and my granddaughter together, that's cross-generational right there learning. Or having a grandmother and a grandchild, or an elder with a youth. Having two generations together makes something cross-generational. So less so much in far as learning in cohorts all of the time. So in the future, I definitely see churches doing more of that and less isolated, segmented classroom settings for education. I also see, once we come back from the pandemic, that perhaps children leaving for the liturgy of the word, going away, and children being together with families, all of us being together in worship as we focus on worship together, and that being the main piece of formation. And how can we help support then parents, but everyone at home in developing spiritual practices, going back to that renewal works piece that we learned that people are really hungry for. And also that way we can tap into those who aren't affiliated with our churches, who we know may be spiritually hungry also and aren't going to show up for Bible study or things like that. How can we support households, not families, but households at home? I really hope we drop the word family when we're talking about our church community and use households instead. But anyways, these generations that are with us already now are going to be known as screen agers, which I thought was interesting and scary at the same time. The next part I want to move to is some work by Institute for the Future. And some of you might have heard of them already because some of their language that they used talked about a VUCA world. And this organization, which is based in, not surprisingly, Palo Alto, California, which is the whole .com area of the world, at least at one point it was the epicenter of it. In 2008, the Episcopal Church, the Consortium of Endowed Episcopal Parishes, or SEEP as they are known, contracted with this group of folks and Bob Johansen, who is their executive director, and asked them, and they're futurists, this organization, made up of sociologists and a variety of folks that really look to the future and to figure out, okay, what is driving the future? What are things that we can expect to happen in the future? And they spoke at a SEEP conference in 2008 that I was privileged to attend. And the stuff that they predicted was, for many of us, just unconceivable. We just could not picture it all. And a lot of people there sort of poo-pooed it and said, yeah, no way, this is not going to happen. And this does not affect the church. Well, guess what? It has, for sure. And a lot of what they said has come true. And part of, I believe I put it in the toolbox, and I'm going to just kind of lift this up in front of the screen here. There's a trifold, it was a trifold brochure, but it'll be a PDF. And it lists all of these future forces that will affect the Episcopal Church. Now, this was 10 years ago that this was done. And so I thought they're still well, they're not driving forces. They're real forces right now. And a provocation is something that what we believe is going to happen. The driving forces will lead to provocations of what we want to think about. So I'd like to share some of them with you. And if I did not share a link already, there was a book that a little booklet that they produced for the Episcopal Church. And I'm going to share some of that information with you in this, but I did find that there is a link for that online now too. So I'll share that with you. But I'd like to talk about what these driving forces mean. And first, what is a VUCA world, or VUCA? I guess they also say VUCA world. Volatility. And they felt that volatility yields to vision. So if something's volatile going on, what vision can that give us? We need to look positive to all of these things. Uncertainty yields to understanding, not to be afraid of what we don't know. Complexity leads to clarity. How can we take complex things and break them down so that we understand them? And ambiguity yields to agility. We can't be stuck in our places. We need to be flexible and agile and moving forward and not leaning on the past, which is really hard in our churches today to do that. But we're going to have to. Bob Johansen and his group would say, if the Episcopal Church is going to survive, we need to be a lot more nimble and a lot more agile. living with ambiguity in all of this. So they list 14 things that are going to be driving forces. He knows that there are going to be, and I've only listed some of them that I think we've seen already, is that personal empowerment, that we know that we can be we're our own consumers. We can decide what we want to do now. We can customize things. We can decide, we can decide what we want to do all the time, whether we come to church or not. So for the church, what they had is they offer questions, and that'll be in this little booklet. I'll make sure you get a link to. Our questions might be, as people become more than consumers, they also need to assume greater responsibility for what they are consuming. So how can the church help and empower people to consume in ethical ways? Think about climate change. Think about a provocation on the other side, the rich-poor gap. We've seen that grow farther and farther apart. Lots of what's happened in the past 3-4 years that they predicted, the driving forces and the provocations have happened, such as the rich-poor gap, personal empowerment, extreme climate variability, grassroots economics. And that might be, how can we help people, those that are rich, because we know there's a big rich-poor gap, but the economics of that, how can we help those who are rich in our communities, because we know they're there? How can we help them share their wealth with the poor, with others? How can the church be a conduit to help empower them to do that? Smart networking. I think we're doing that now, but how can our church function more like a smart network instead of a hierarchy? That can be a bit threatening. The polarizing extremes that we have. How can the church help foster the differences between those two, whether it's red or blue state, or on issues of racial equality, of economic equality, healthcare, education, all of those things. A lot of social justice, I think we can tap into with those. The high impact religious is another. How can Episcopalians if people think of us as a thinking religion, how can we have an impact on those that might be polarized? If we think so much, how can we help people think greater or be more open to think in new and different ways? Another one which is really interesting is body hacking. I don't think we've totally seen all of this yet, but it's starting to, with people who can have chips implanted within them to help them hear better, or brain implants to help trigger certain things or get rid of certain things like headaches or dizziness. We've certainly seen it. This is where ethical issues come into play, as more DNA and genoming things start. The whole thing about the vaccine, what was that created out of? A synthetic vaccine. Was DNA really used in that, and things like that? So how can the church help us spiritually with informed choices? And then when do we start talking about when we are playing God in that? Lots of ethical questions that the church can help people discern about. As baby boomers get older and retire and age a whole lot more, they're going to need help. How is the church ready to help? How are they encouraging younger generations to assist in that? And how are we embracing older generations as they regenerate themselves and they refire themselves when they retire? They get refired and take on new careers. Youth are digital. How can we create constructive, healthy relationships with them when they're so tied to their screens? How can we provide experiential practices in which we're communicating with one another. We've certainly experienced a digital physical blend during COVID. So, and churches have had to learn really fast how to do that. So, when the pandemic is over and we're able to meet together again, how will we keep what has worked in all of this? And how will we let it go? My understanding is that my congregation is going to continue to tape and broadcast services live now. And we never had any of the technology in our physical space before that. But during the pandemic, new speakers were installed, and there's a whole new system in our sanctuary now. Not in the rest of the parish, but in the sanctuary there is for sure now. And so there's 14 of these. I could go on and on explaining some of them, but knowing that, where is the church going to be in helping people work out this new thing, especially, I would even say Gen X folks, but certainly millennials and those who are younger we're going to be looking to them for helping us. So how are we developing relationships across all generations for that? One of the things, and there is on Think Tank, which is a ministry at Virginia Theological Seminary that is allowing people to try on new things, especially during this time of COVID, but they began before that. They had a webinar, less than a year ago, but it's been recorded, and I will make sure that link gets to you, that you can watch it again, because it was, I reviewed it earlier this week, and I found it really impacts a lot of what we were doing today. And so his full spectrum thinking is, and he talks about the virus right now, is what we can't see the future is going to be. He says that's impossible. What we can do is we can learn to love clarity. There's that, we use clarity a lot, and not certainty. He says to be very clear about where we are going and very flexible about how we get there. So trial and error will be a thing that we will need to be doing a lot. And one thing he mentioned was avoid people who use the word absolutely a lot. So if somebody says, but absolutely we have to do this, we need to push back and say, well, maybe not. There may be another way to do that. And for us to use our stories about that, look at stories of the past, but also start to imagine what stories of the future might look like. And so that's what we can be doing right now. And think about, what did we do pre-pandemic, pre-virus? What was our mindset? What was our stories? What were our stories about the future at that time? And we know perhaps that's changed, but we need to go back and think about what we thought our future was going to be. So the foresight in his full spectrum thinking is that we need to make sure we're capturing stories right now for what's happening, and then capture stories post-outbreak. So we can look back and see where we've grown, where we haven't done well, and use that as insight. It says, if you really look at what's happened before, what's happening now, and focus with clarity as much as possible with what you see, that what you'll see is things that you can never forget. We won't unsee. My guess is, for example, we will not unsee having spiritual communion. Watching, well, for me, I guess I'm speaking for myself, watching a celebrant sort of prepare Eucharist, but none of us receiving. So how, we're not going to be unsee that. So how are we going to move on from that also? And for those that maybe will not be able to receive in the distant future because of touch and sharing of objects. So then the action then is finding an agile way that we can look forward. What stories do we want to have in the future? He says, being present future is constraining, but future backward allows us to shape it, if that makes any sense. I had to say that over in my head several times when I heard it. He said, being present future is constraining. Being in the present, looking to the future. That's really hard to do. But looking into the future and thinking backwards allows us to shape what might be to come. So the goals that we might have are those aha moments that happen. He says it might be a new story, a new moment of all of that. And the other thing he says that often happens during times like this, where we are in the moment, whatever that is, it's very noisy. He says the present is always noisy. And so we need to, as much as possible, and I think we can do this as a church because of the spiritual practices we have of mindfulness, which is a big word right now, which is not surprising, is to filter out that noise and to then look at what signals or what stories are in our minds once we can filter out all the extraneous stuff that's going on, and then use that to look forward to. A lot of information, I know here. So he says, well, we know we've got true digital natives amongst us. And he definitely uses of course, he has a new book about all of this. And on the cover of it is this huge spectrum of the rainbow that looks, all variations there. And he believes that the church can be a leader in social change. If we can, and I'm guessing through a collaboration with those who are technically adept, we can use visualization, neuroscience, which we're learning lots about now, and gamification to be leaders of social change. If we can learn to live in a world that is both and there's that ambiguity again, we can be leaders of social change. If we can be more imaginative, and I think we can, where are those wonder questions? I wonder that we use with children. We need to use them with adults a whole lot more. I wonder if, and to stop clinging to categories. And he used brick and mortar stores as a category, but we could also use our church building as a category, that we're not getting rid of them, but to stop clinging to them and think what has worked during this period of time. How can our imaginations go with what has worked with that? He would say that Martin Luther King Jr. was a leader of social change. And while maybe he didn't have the tools of neuroscience and gamification or visualization in those terms, he used those. And maybe a different, more term that would have happened in the 1960s, 50s and 60s. But he was able to live in a both and world. He was more imaginative, and he did not cling to categories. He was able to broaden that and accomplish great things. Of course, it wasn't, there was a price to pay for that. But he says he felt that was the role of the church in the future. And I think that's a very creative and hopeful way of thinking. So we know that these true digital natives, those who've been born in the past, I'll say 3 generations, they have the ability to see clarity across gradients of possibility. We need to encourage that, and we need to help them tell stories of that and help us think that way too. Some of us, I think, can think that way. Resist certainty and avoid new things in old categories. And for sure, there are plenty of children and youth who aren't able to do these things too. But to know that we as humans, we have the capability to do all of those things. So this is where we're going to break out. But I'm going to share take off the screen again. But first, lead a conversation in our areas. Oh, thank you. You did that for me. Of how would, and this is, I'm going to jump back to the Maria Harris piece with thinking about liturgy, outreach and mission, service, being in community with one another. So all of those pieces. How do you see this playing out today with in our churches or reaching beyond? How can we connect some of this? Any thoughts or any questions about any of these sort of research futurists kinds of things?
You know what I'm really struck, I hope you don't mind if I pop right in and ask, is so I have that book right here. I got it. Yep. And the full spectrum thinking. And we use that word clarity a lot in the Diocese of Washington. We're always reaching for clarity, right? And so what I see, though, is when I'm reading religious material from other denominations, particularly the evangelical church. So there's always 3 steps to this, 7 steps to that, 5 steps to this. What's your next step? And like, we're starting to use that kind of language in the Diocese of Washington. And I wonder, and I think that's good, right? Like, I think sometimes we need to, when we greet new people into our congregations, we need to know, like, how do we onboard people? How do we introduce ourselves? We are complex people, right? And I'm never going to give that up. I will leave the Episcopal Church if it decides to be not complex. But I guess my question is that, how do we claim that? Like, how do we claim that both and identity that I do? And is it true? Is it true that is the future, right? And if it is true, how do we claim it in a way that's understandable? I guess that. Many insights, people?
I mean, I think we need to claim it. I mean, and it's not that I can do that myself very well all the time, but I think where there has been, is progress the right word? Where there's been movement to adapt to things that are changing, or how we move forward to, well, I think about the pandemic. The use of science to be able to come up with these vaccines, which I think has been pretty quick. I mean, I guess we have the technology and the science to do that, but there had to have been a whole lot of both and thinking for that to happen, and both trial and error and doing things that had never been done before for that to happen. And how it's now being rolled out. You know, people keep changing how, what cohort needs to get vaccinated whenever, as every state does it differently. I think there's some both and in that, agencies or those leadership are changing their positions often when they're realizing, oh, wait a minute, we can do something a different way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Some of that?
I was thinking maybe we can be clear about, we're still a thinking church. When you come here, you're going to get questions. And when you come here, and I think the other thing where we have a gift for the world or for the life of faith is we're also very story based, right? And so maybe going to the future, thinking, I'm trying to think about what are best practices for our congregations when it comes to faith formation in the future. And perhaps one of those things is really to emphasize the stories,
Mhm.
that's why I love Godly Play so much, right?
Mhm.
That it invites us into the stories.
Mhm.
And maybe we could, I think we need to work harder to do that for adults.
Mhm.
What,
Mhm.
what do others think?
So one of those things that I'm seeing sort of happen in the spiritual direction community is there's a sizable number of people who are integrating some of these spiritual practices with role-playing games. And how do those, because I mean, that's role-playing games, a lot of them are story to begin with. You're creating an interactive story. And so one of the workshops I'm going to in the conference next month is all about that. How does that get incorporated? And there's a large, no, it's not large, but there's a, what the heck is the thing? I had to take it off the computer because Windows screwed it up. Discord. There's a fairly significant Discord group of this community of folks that are doing this integration of spiritual direction and spiritual practices with role-playing games. It's fascinating.
I think the other area where we have a not competitive edge, but it's who we are. And actually, I've had conversations with evangelical consultants about what they think growth engines are for religious communities. And I say justice is one, and they're always telling me, no, it's not. And I said, no, for the Episcopal Church, it is. Commitment to, and I think that that's what speaks. I know my own children who are in their 20s, that's what makes them want to be part of the church, is that we're committed to creation care, we're committed to racial justice, we're committed to the wage in income and wealth gaps, addressing those issues. And I think that also is a futurist, right? Everything's connected, everything's interconnected. My life, Monday through Friday, is not divorced from my weekend life. And the more we can do that as churches in our formation, the better off. I think that's where we should be.
That Johansson talks a lot about that. How can we as a church take the sacred to the secular and vice versa? Because we all have the same passions and the same call to work on addressing unjust structures. So that would be climate change in the environment, racial inequality, inequality of health, education, all of those things. And the Episcopal Church, I mean, we're already in that, as a church-wide body is. I wonder how much on the local level folks are. I mean, my congregation isn't. We're just starting to figure out, work on racial justice stuff. I mean, and it's just the beginning because nobody's wanted to talk about it until now. But we said, guess what? This is important now. And I mean, there's a lot more folks who are now interested in that. But I think that's another way to reach others. So we've invited others from the community to participate in this, justice work that we're starting to do and incorporate them. And folks are like, wow, you're doing this in the church? We're like, yes, this is part of what we feel called to do, which has been a surprise to some. And then some in our parish are like, oh, no, but we're like, no, we're going to do this anyways, kind of thing. So I think, not being afraid to tell our story outside the church, but then still within, continually telling and encouraging people how to tell their own story also, because we haven't done I don't think we've done a super job with that with older generations,
I think our preachers and our rectors can can model that in ways that I don't see a whole lot of. I took a course and looking at the School for Offering. This course is how to engage your community beyond Zoom is the title of the class. And it basically asks preachers their Sunday message. This is a class that is not an Episcopal class. It's from a Lutheran church. So it's your Sunday message. And how do you push it out Monday through Friday? And like, I don't know. I just came out of seminary a few years ago. We never talked about, like, you preach on Sunday mornings. That's about all you think about in your preaching, right? But I think preaching is better modeled as Sunday's the beginning, and then you find a way to get that message out differently on Monday on Instagram, and on Tuesday on Facebook, and on Wednesday it's how you doing on the call to action that we all invited you to on Sunday, and then Thursday you're starting to think about the hook for the coming Sunday. And I think that can be true for our formation too, right? Instead of thinking about Sunday morning is the only time, which, I don't know how many of you experience families come or households come once a month, right?
If then, that much.
That we could do well to do our Sunday morning lesson, still do it, but then have tag-alongs on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, some touch points with families and households. Mm-hmm. Are you all thinking, yeah, that sounds like a good idea? Or like, oh, that sounds like work that's not going to have any fruit, Elsie?
Well, I think we need to look at our services and look at providing a variety. Alfred Street Baptist Church, which has grown tremendously, has a come as you are service where people don't have to dress up and they just come as they are and they have fellowship after the service. They also have a Saturday service, and the Diocese of Atlanta has started Imagine Church, which I think is fantastic, even at my age, where it's very simple, just music, a lesson, preaching that is a story, but it's a half an hour, very simple, and it's on Sunday evening. And I think that appeals to a lot of people and meets their needs if they're not interested in coming to the full service on Sunday morning.
Yeah.
So I think we need to look and explore having different kinds of services to meet the different needs of these age groups that we've talked about. And also to incorporate different kinds of music. I am a priest kid. I grew up on the hymnal. I know the first verse of many of them, but it's the hymns from Lift Every Voice and Sing that touch me every time I sing them. So we need to look at having variety of music and services.
Yeah. Where are you, Elsie, if you mind if I ask?
Which church? St. John's, Bellsville.
Okay.
St. John's Zion Parish.
I also think that, our preaching, even though we may be doing it on Sunday and it's recorded, people may be accessing it on other days. And we don't know when they're hearing it also. And why couldn't there then be prompts during the week, for that? I guess tied on to what you were saying, Jennifer, on that. But certainly worship at different times, days of the week, the whole, we know we can do it in a variety of ways now, for sure.
Listening to what y'all were saying, and I thought about, well, if you gave them a prompt, then there's that opportunity for, and here's one way you might connect with this, like whether it's an outreach or we're doing Lexio online, these are the connection points that will help further you in this, with this particular touch point.
We're doing that with our Lenten study. We're putting prompts on Facebook and asking members to share it with their friends. And it's just a short reflection, but that's one way of reaching out.
The Diocese of Washington is also, I'm in conversation with a app developer for your iPhone or for Android device on a path of discipleship. So we have our 5 practices. They are, they're not the way of love, sorry, but they're pray, learn, give, share, serve are the 5. And we didn't want to use the way of love because learn in the way of love is very specifically defined as reading the words of Jesus. And we wanted learn to be a lot more than that. And the phone app, you'll pick the practice and you'll have a progress. There's a little icon for the practice. And then there's another little icon, which will show you how you're progressing on your practice. You click on it, say your age or whatever, you have to log in, and it'll give you like 3 things to do. And eventually, the hope is that our congregations will populate one of those or 1 or 2 of those 3 things, so that because the phone's going to also include like your local Episcopal church. But that would be a way to like push out formation during the week, right?
Mhm.
9:30.
Mhm. I think formation is going to be different in the fact that it's not going to take place during worship in the future. Another group I was speaking with, we talked about how much their online coffee hour has been a really big deal now for them. And that a lot of people, once we can get back into the building, that they're going to want to have an extended coffee hour either before or after worship. And so the thought was, well, that's when you can do formation then, but not during worship because everybody's going to want to be together for that. So whether that formation is a multi-generational learning experience, or is it, the kids go off, the youth go off, I'm not sure, but I think how we manage our time will be a little bit different. It'll be interesting to see that. I think mentoring is something that the church can do really well, and partner with the community. So there are parishes that say, well, we don't have any children, how do we get children here? That's not the point, I don't think. It might be, how can you go out into the community and mentor children in a school system that needs mentorship, to develop, relationships across generations, for that, and, developing more relations across in that way.
That's a great segue into in April, haven't set the dates yet, and they probably will be during the day in the morning because of the person leading them, but we'll make sure we record them. But there's going to be an offering on intergenerational VBS by Siobhan Wilkinson, who is in the northern Montgomery County. She's at St. John's Olney, and she's developed her own, over the years, a number of intergenerational VBSs. And so she's going to talk about her experience there. And then the other is, has had huge success in creating, not mentorship, they're prayer partners between adults and children. And that has been transformational also for St. John's. So.
Cool. I had one more slide I realized I wanted to share with you, but we've talked about a lot of these already in this, because I know our time is up. But, certainly, talking about household formation, small groups, service, and we've mentioned all of these. So I wanted to get the slide up here on the recording for that. And then one more here was that there is a resurgence already in the catechumenate, faith at home, inter and multi-generational and spiritual practices for that. I just wanted to make sure those got included for those who'll be watching the recording.
Well, thank you, Sharon. And I'm so glad that you're like, this is great, because the Diocese of Washington is now piloting a catechumenate. So there's 40 people going through it right now.
Wow, that's great. More and more dioceses are doing that, are sponsoring those kinds of things, which is.
You all will hear more. And Thank you, Sharon.
You're welcome.
And thank you all for coming. And please do not be a stranger to me or to us at the Diocese of Washington. Please reach out anytime that you need. You have questions or want to collaborate. We're here we're here for you, and a great connector of deep wisdom from people like Sharon and from within our community. So thanks so much for joining us.